Story 1. Being burned alive. I saw a guy who was playing with gasoline get burned alive. The smell and sounds he made were something I will never forget. Luckily, it only lasted a few minutes before he passed out. But the next 10 years and hundreds of surgeries were terrible. He said many times we should have let him die. Story 2. Dying slowly as a prisoner in your own body. My aunt died of multiple system atrophy 3 years ago after nearly 7 or 8 years of slowly fading away. Her brother died of motor neuron disease 2 months ago. Horrible illnesses. Story 3. Prolonged physical assault at that time resulted in being bedridden forever after. The man I assisted to nurse was a Sydney City store owner who was beaten with a steering wheel lock. Now his elbows were locked with his arms closed and his fingers immobile. He cried big tears silently, curled permanently in his bed, as he had for the previous 8 years. Story 4. Lock-in syndrome, eternal torture, stuff like that. Death is just death. The only ones bothered by that are everyone else but you because you are dead, so there is nothing to feel in the first place. Though I guess hell could be real, and so I guess hell would be worse than dying. Story 5. Watching my mom slowly disappear to Alzheimer's. She is physically here but mentally gone and does not even recognize me anymore. I visit her every day at the care facility and each time she treats me like a stranger. Death would have been kinder. Story 6. Knowing you are alone even when there are a lot of people around and no one respects your opinion, and you are always the minor even when you are the right one. Story 7. Worse than death is the failure to start living, Marcus Aurelius. It becomes even more heartbreaking when you realize you are falling into the void of meaninglessness and don't know how, or are too scared to, change anything. Story 8. Burning in hell sounds pretty bad. Now, I don't know if your soul eventually dies or if the pain is so bad your mind is destroyed. But if true, one would want to hedge their bets and say, "Hey God, if you are really up there, help me to not end up there." Story 9. What was it like before you were born? I don't want to go back to that. I've lost loved ones. I deal with soul-crushing migraines, but I don't want to go back to non-existence. So I'll let you know. Maybe if someone finds a way to keep me alive while literally on fire, I'd prefer death, but only if I had no hope of ever escaping it. Otherwise, I just want morphine. Story 10. Radiation exposure. The fate of Hisashi Aoki is the worst I've read about. Extent of radiation exposure. As we know, Aoki suffered a 17-sievert radiation hit during the Tokamura incident. Exposure to this level of radiation causes immediate and widespread damage to the body. DNA starts to break down, which prevents cell repair and replication, resulting in massive cell death. The bone marrow is destroyed, halting blood cell reproduction, causing anemia, immune failure, and bleeding. The gastrointestinal tract is also damaged, resulting in vomiting and dehydration. Skin and tissues suffer severe radiation burns and blisters, leaving the body vulnerable to fatal infections. This and the organ failure resulted in a decline in health and eventual death in Aoki's case. Symptoms and immediate health effects. Initially, Aoki's symptoms were not visibly dramatic. He appeared stable, with only redness around his face and a swollen hand. However, medical tests revealed that his lymphocyte count had plummeted to nearly 0, leaving him susceptible to infections. Within days, the true extent of his injuries became apparent. His skin began to peel off and he developed severe blisters. His organs were damaged, and he required oxygen because his ability to breathe quickly deteriorated. His immune system was also destroyed, leaving him defenseless against viruses, infections, and other complications. Despite this, Aoki was kept alive for many days after the accident, kept in a special radiation ward designed to deal with acute radiation syndrome. Hospitalization and treatment methods. Following the accident, Aoki was initially treated at the National Institute of Radiological Sciences in Chiba. He was then taken to the University of Tokyo Hospital for advanced care. His treatment included several aggressive interventions to counteract the radiation damage. Here is what technician Hisashi Aoki was treated with: stem cell transplants. Aoki received a peripheral blood transplant from his sister. The procedure was experimental but aimed to regenerate his bone marrow and restore the production of blood cells. While there were early signs of improvement, the extensive effects of radiation poisoning eventually negated them. Skin grafts and blood transfusions. To address the blood loss and skin damage, Aoki went through multiple skin grafts and blood transfusions. But his body's inability to regenerate cells rendered these efforts ineffective. Medication. Aoki was given broad-spectrum antibiotics, painkillers, and granulocyte colony-stimulating factors to improve his immune response. However, despite these, his condition only worsened. Throughout his 83-day struggle, Aoki endured severe pain and multiple organ failure. He suffered several heart attacks, and despite his declining state, his family chose to continue resuscitative efforts, which raised concerns about the ethics of his treatment. Eventually, his body could no longer overcome the damage, and he died on December 21, 1999, underscoring the profound human cost of nuclear accidents and the need for access to emergency medicine and safety in the industry. Story 11. Living with unending pain, regret, or complete isolation can feel worse than death for some. It's not just about living, but the quality of life that matters. Story 12. Seeing all of your kids die. It's hard to explain, but the love you feel for your kid is a different kind of love than what you feel for your partner. I cannot imagine a world without them. Story 13. Loneliness. I was being violently abused by my partner, and I had no contact with my family. Ironically, my abuser wasn't the one who worked on isolating me. My family is simply terrible and acts like I don't exist most of the time. But still, being abused, not having any family member check on me, and being too traumatized and depressed to socialize meant I was the loneliest I've ever been. And this is coming from someone who loves being at home and having time alone. I remember not having any friends at all, not having anyone say hi. It made me realize that being thought about, being spoken to just because you're a person, opposed to being spoken to by a cashier at the store or because you're a coworker at your workplace, for example, is humanizing. That's when I realized what "it's the thought that counts" meant. That's when I realized the value of being spoken to. It's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't felt it. Story 14. Death probably isn't even bad. If it's just nothing and you don't exist at all, then you just don't exist. Dying, on the other hand, is scary and painful, so dying is scarier than death in my opinion. Also, torture is worse as it's just human-inflicted dying but prolonged, and you might not even get the sweet release of death. Story 15. I would say John Jones's experience being stuck upside down for more than 24 hours in a tight cave before he eventually died. I saw a video on that case on YouTube and it has haunted me ever since. In a case like that, a quick death is probably better than what he went through. I would have asked the rescue people to just shoot me. Story 16. Alzheimer's or any other neurodegenerative disease. Imagine just like losing yourself as your memories and recognition fade and everything just becomes a jumble of old and new memories, people and places that no longer exist, and feelings you can't control because you don't know why you're having them. Story 17. Dementia. I'd rather kill myself if my brain starts to go. I don't want to be a burden on my family or just an empty husk of myself. No thanks. I'd rather find a nice cliff to dive off. Story 18. Living with no emotions. I have bipolar type 2, and before I was diagnosed, I was mainly severely depressed and sometimes had highs of hypomania. But for one whole year, I just had no emotions. I actually wished I could be suicidal again because the feeling of not feeling was the worst thing I have ever experienced. No happiness or sadness, anger or fear. Just nothing at all and completely empty. I ended up doing a lot of reckless things during that time to try and get myself to feel something. Story 19. Alzheimer's. I watched my mom slowly forget everything, first small things, then who I was, and finally who she was. It's like experiencing death over and over, except the person is still physically there. It has been 3 years and it still breaks me. Story 20. Living with negative thoughts and feelings. Living with poor mental health. Living unemployed and broke. Living while being suicidal. Living in general is worse than death because you are constantly seeing, feeling, and experiencing things that you do or don't want to. You don't have as much control as you think. With death, it's all over, no positives and no negatives. You don't have to continue going through a roller coaster life. I don't know what happens after death, but it can't be worse than life. I'll choose death over living. I'm sure many of us would, but the fear of dying isn't the problem. The fear of not knowing what happens after is. Story 21. Being cursed for generations, like a generational curse. Example. If all your descendants and anyone under your guardianship will get hemophilia. That's why it's a pretty unfortunate curse. Story 22. I read about this guy named Haubin, who was misdiagnosed as having a coma. He lived in this state for 23 years, while fully conscious, before correctly being diagnosed with locked-in syndrome. That is far worse than death. Pure nightmare fuel. Story 23. Instead of dying yourself, it feels worse losing a loved one or a pet. I'm not as concerned about when I go, but rather the people I love or our pets. We've already lost one of our dogs and my dad. I have depression, hence why I'm not as worried about when I go. Depression also is one of the worst things ever. Story 24. Probably having a child that just seems to have vanished without a trace from this earth. The parents don't know if the child still lives, is dead, or encountered bad people who took them. And there are no witnesses or hints. You will never be able to get over this and may go crazy. Story 25. I had a guy that wrecked his motorcycle and he slid down the road. He was rotating on his back like a windmill as he struck the guardrail. All 4 of his limbs got stretched and ripped off. The stretching force caused all of his arteries to constrict and retract, so he didn't bleed to death. He wasn't wearing proper riding gear, so all of the skin on his back got eaten away by road rash, and his butt was ground down to his ischium. He was conscious the whole time and never hit his head. He survived as a quadruple amputee with full-thickness road rash covering his entire back and no neurological injuries. Story 26. For others, severe dementia without an underlying health problem. They live long without a clue of their lives and perhaps berating everyone around them. It's a waste of time, no quality of life. For yourself, perhaps knowing you enabled a psychopath to become the most powerful man in the world after he specifically told you he was going to mess everything up and your evidence was only everything he did in his last term and everything he has said and done since, and you have to live with that shame, stupidity, lack of any moral guidance, lack of any human decency, lack of any concept of compassion. I could go on. Story 27. A very slow death. Nurse here. Make your wishes known. Put it in writing. Appoint someone you trust to make your healthcare decisions based on your wishes. Think of quality versus quantity. Story 28. Being skinned alive, dipped in vinegar, then having your fingers and toes removed with an axe one at a time. Then your eyes gouged out, your tongue ripped from your mouth with pliers. Then, Story 29. At least you are alive after that to get revenge, justice, etc. But I think the act of getting raped is worse than murder. Someone violating you while you can do nothing is brutal. Story 30. I am a nurse. I think the biggest concern is your family keeping you alive as basically a vegetable after sustaining an illness or some type of trauma where you will never return to your baseline function. Advanced directives are so important. Story 31. There are a few things I fear the most as a woman. Being raped and not allowed to abort or give away the child, and then you grow to hate and love it at the same time. Being raped as a little girl or with exceptional brutality. Bearing a child who will stay a child forever due to their disability. The father of my child disappears when he finds out about it, or, if not, instead of helping, is an additional burden. My child being raped or killed. All the other things I can carry somehow. Story 32. Deep betrayal by someone you cared for deeply, and someone that you believed felt the same way about you. True loneliness being alone. A few things. Story 33. There is a torture method in which you are tied to the floor, arms and legs spread out. Then bamboo is planted beneath you. That grows fast and through your body. Also, it does not leave open wounds, so you will not die from blood loss. Story 34. Being immortal. No question. You have almost all the other points given people mentioned here. You will lose all your loved ones. Your brain possibly cannot deal with infinity, so over time, you will lose all core memories that make you you. And at some point, When everything is gone, you float through nothingness in endless boredom, not knowing who you are and where you came from. And it never ends. Story 35. I would say going through life with hate or no love for yourself has got to be rough. Being oppressed, abused, bullied, degraded, etc. Every day has to be pretty bad too. Having a painful medical condition and an addiction you can't beat. Those all seem like hard lives. Story 36. Someone said, when you start feeling less motivated about life and have no desire for wealth and materialistic things, it's a sign your soul is ready to leave. I'm still in the same sitting position. Story 37. Death of a loved one, like your own child, and having to live on accepting the pain for the rest of your life, wondering what it could be like to be the parent who gets to watch their child grow into a human. Story 38. Being immortal, living trillions of years, witnessing the cold death of the universe and existing forever in the void. With nothing but darkness, no sound. Just eternally trapped in your mind. Story 39. What could be worse than death might be living a life devoid of purpose, passion, or connection. It is the feeling of being trapped in a cycle of despair, unable to experience joy or fulfillment. Story 40. Since we don't know how bad or good death could be, depending on your beliefs, I guess, there's no way to know the answer to this. It's like rating the content of a mystery box.